All right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm here with Shay. Um, we'll just call her Shay. Shay
Yeah.
Unleashed, I think, is the X account, right?
Yeah.
hmm And I've seen her around talking about philosophical topics, identitarian issues, and generally good takes. But in particular, I saw her talking about the many worlds interpretation, which most of you guys know I'm a big fan of. And so I thought we could have a discussion about that, also just generally philosophy and, her worldview. So to start with, how did you get into this whole space? Why did you decide to make an X account? How did you get into philosophy?
Um, so I want to say I've always kind of been interested in philosophy. I was kind of like always an oddball when I was a kid. The best way that I learn is to understand why things are the way that they are, like how they work. And yeah, so I've always been interested in that. And then for Twitter, originally I was a Trump supporter. I had a Twitter account a long time ago, never used it. And then I got back on for I believe I was watching Alex Jones a lot. That's what it was. And then I got into more of like the JQ space and like anti-Trump and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I kind of just use it to just say what I think, and that's about
Oh,
it.
you know what? We got an audio issue here. I put my headphones in, but didn't actually switch the output. So give me 1 second. Mm-mm. Okay, 1 second again. Go ahead and mute you on my end for just a minute. The RTTL podcast setup is now interfering because we have to use a mixer. So I have all these different audio outputs now to keep track of. Mm-mm. Okay, that should have done it. Seems like no. All right, check again. Mm-hmm. Okay, there we go.
Good.
Yes, finally.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry for the slow start, everybody. If you have questions for Shay or just want to participate in the discussion, I posted the entropy link, so I'll be checking on that. But yeah, so Trump supporter, wanted to get involved watching Alex Jones. So I guess you're a
Yeah.
conspiracy theorist as well.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any favorite conspiracies?
Um, I don't know. I think most of them can have kind of come true at this point, so there's not much left to go on
Mm-hmm.
aside from really what this is.
What this is, as in
Yeah, this.
this,
Yeah,
right?
pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Was there one conspiracy that kind of drew you in to that whole world?
Um, I don't I don't know. You know what? I think everything originated with like God and religion. I think that's where it all started for me, and I was pretty young. Um, I always kind of wanted to fit into some sort of religion, but none of them really worked for me. It didn't really make sense to me, so I kind of stuck to myself and just figured out my own sort of understanding of what this is, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What was your religious background?
None. I grew up, my family's not religious. Yeah, there's nothing really to it. My cousin used to take me to church all the time, so yeah, I wanted to be interested in Christianity. I looked into it quite a bit, and then it just didn't really sit completely right with me, so I never fell into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was raised like lapsed Catholic or quasi Christian. My mom was raised Catholic, but then she wasn't practicing. And then I was like Protestant, Catholic, atheist, on and off until college. And then I was an atheist for a little while in a more informed way, getting philosophically interested, reading a lot about physics. My big pathway into philosophy was like popular physics books, that sort of thing. I watched the Science Channel all the time as a kid. The conspiracy world, what really drew me in was 9/11. So I was in Army Reserve Band and we did a march in New York City at the same time that Occupy Wall Street was going on. And I wanted to go check that out and see what all that was about. And some old guy was talking about 9/11 truth. And I started, asking him questions and trying to make sense of it. And he had a response for every objection. And then at the end of it, he gave me this DVD, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And I went home and watched it. And like my mind was blown. I was like, why did I join the army? These people are evil. Um, but yeah. So with regard to philosophy, then, did you start reading like historical authors or just kind of thinking on your own?
No, it's more just experimental thoughts and trying to prove myself wrong and figure out whatever makes the most logical sense and whatever I can't prove wrong, I guess. Yeah,
Mhm.
so my parents were always like super kind of conspiracy theorists, so like 9/11 wasn't really a surprise, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, I was kind of weird in school when they were teaching us 9/11. I was the one that was like, yeah, it was an inside job. And I was pretty young at the time, so yeah, I've always just kind of been in this ideology, I guess you could say.
Hmm. All right. Thinking for yourself. That's good. Do you align philosophically with your parents' views?
Um, Yeah, I think so for the most part. Yeah, I would say so. They're not extremely interested in this kind of stuff, but um yeah, I guess I try and teach them as much as I can, but there's only so many people that actually care, you know.
Right. If you had to class your views, or for that matter, those of your parents, like, what would you call yourself philosophically?
Um I don't know. I'm not really like super knowledgeable about philosophy like book smarts, but yeah, I like to think deeply about stuff and I don't
Mhm.
know. Yeah.
Okay, well, we can just go through the topics in philosophy and I'll try to class you if I can. So, with regard to ethics, like, what's the nature of ethical right and wrong? Is it objective? Is it something that we create?
I think it's definitely something we create. So,
Hmm.
my idea of God is like the source, right? It's the good and the bad, it's the everything. And then once you're in this human experience, you kind of categorize things as whether we believe them to be good, of like service to self or service to others, which is kind of the easiest way to classify it, I guess you could say. Um, yeah, I don't know. So, I think it's more of a human thing. It's like if a lion kills its cubs, you know, it's not really evil. It's just, it is what it is. And you can classify it based on, you know, being in this experience and what you think is right or wrong. But aside from that, like nature just is. So,
Hmm. I mean, there are things that work and don't work for an organism, though,
oh, for
and
sure.
that's objective. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe that's sort of a semantic point at some level. Like, with regard to art, what about aesthetic value? Do you think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or is there objective standards in art?
I think there's both.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I guess, you know, people have different standards and see things in different ways, and that could be based on their life experience or whatever. But objectively, there is. But again, if we were outside of this experiment experience, we could probably see everything as beautiful in a way, you know.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Schopenhauer thought that everything had some beauty in it. And really it's in line with Platonism as well. Just curious, have you read any Plato? Familiar at all with?
So I watch a lot of YouTube,
Mhm.
so I've seen a lot of videos, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. I haven't really read anything on him, but
Okay.
yeah.
Um, well, just on that point, the whole philosophy there is essentially form and matter. right? Like there are paradigms for things in the world, kind of in the intelligible realm. Those are universals, those are things that never change. And then they have reflections or images in the world of generation where they're embedded in matter. But matter itself is kind of privatory, or it's the absence of form rather than some kind of positive substance in its own right. And so, form is really what you find in the material world that does have positive substance. Form is more real in some sense than matter, and form is like the more something has form, the more beautiful it is in the Platonic worldview. So if you embody all of the formative principles of nature, like maybe in our world, man embodies all of those principles together in one more than other things because we rationally reflect on the universe and kind of contain the universe in a way that other things don't. So we have more form and therefore are more beautiful in some sense. And then the further down you go, the less of those formative principles or reason principles of nature that you'll find in a system or an object. And so it's less beautiful. But still, what makes it real is some kind of, the same thing that makes something beautiful is what you find structuring and giving reality to mundane things. Platonic perspective. Okay, let's take another approach. Can you repeat what exactly is your notion of God and how did you come to it?
Um, so God is the, I don't know, you could call it source, energy, light of everything to ever exist, and we are versions of God, and everything is a version of God in its own way.
Mhm.
I think once you bring it to the simplest form, that's really all that it is. So we are just manifestations of different versions of that same energy, I would say.
Mhm. How did you determine that there must be like one source or something like God?
Um, well, everything, everything kind of duplicates, I guess. You have man and woman, and then it creates baby, whatever. But um, I don't know. Everything came from something, at least that's what I believe. I don't know, unless we're in a simulation and you could say we're in a video game and whatever. But even then, it's still just, it starts from energy, zeros and ones, and then it creates into more. It's like the superposition, I guess. And then that turns into its own defined yes, no, wrong, right.
Okay. Proclus's, and sorry to just like keep throwing Greek philosophy at you, but it's now like I was more independent minded and I thought a lot for myself and based on modern physics theories and stuff. I still do, but now that I've studied Neoplatonism, like they had a tradition that lasted 1,000 years, and it it ended up being pretty consistent and neatly organized. And so I find that I just like slip into their ways of thinking very easily. But Proclus, his basic argument is that you can't have a multiplicity as the first principle, and you need some first principle for the same reason that you gave. Like everything comes from something. There's a cause for the being of everything that we observe, and so the universe as a whole, it as a multiplicity of things can't be the first principle because something transcends that multiplicity itself and explains how those things are related. Um, like if you have a set of numbers, you have the various numbers that make up the set, and then you have the set itself that allows us to perceive the multitude. So, like any multiplicity, there's some kind of transcendental unity already presupposed in it. There aren't just pure particulars or pure multiplicity because they're all brought into one for us and they have some common syntax through which they're understood. There's some substrate that they share in common. Chris Langan, you know him? Have you seen him on X?
Um, I don't know. I have terrible memory. I can't remember names very well, but if I saw a face, I might.
hmm Yeah, I mean, he posts, I think he's like in his 60s now, but he was recorded as having the highest IQ in the US at a certain point in time. He did the circuit in mainstream media and actually won like $250,000 in a game show. They brought
Oh,
him on because
wow.
he was supposed to be the
Actually, I
smartest
think I've
guy.
heard of that. Yeah. Was
Yeah,
he banned from it or something? Was
from the
that
game
him or was
show.
that, yeah, from participating in them?
Um, in the future after that, maybe. But
Okay.
anyway, he got his money and then bought a ranch in Missouri, so that's where he currently lives. But but yeah, so he has this model, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. That's his big philosophy, and one of his principles is syndephonesis, and that's basically what I was just saying. Where if you have two things, like as linguistic objects, they share necessarily a common semantic medium or syntactic medium where it's like through the common language of English, all of the various English terms are intelligible, but they share necessarily some substrate. Um, and then syndiphionic regression is the concept that, okay, well, this substrate, then, this syntactic medium might be one of several. Like there's English and Spanish and Chinese, but they're all languages with some kind of deep commonality rooted in, I don't know, like Chomskyan universal grammar, maybe, or some other very primitive kind of communicative principle, not specific to any given language. And then you go deeper than that and go beyond like human language to all sorts of principles in communication and then like information broadly until you get down to like the ones and zeros that somehow make up the universe if it is reducible to information, which I think. But yeah, so like you're touching on some of those principles. I could hear that in your response. So what do you think about I guess the most fundamental thing in the world? Do you think that it reduces to information? Would you call yourself an idealist in that sense about physical things? Or
Um, it's because once you get so far, it kind of gets confusing, but I don't know, like it's like where does thought come from? Where does the ideas come from? Where does it come from before it gets to your head? So that's where the source or like a field or whatever that may be. Um, there's definitely something to it, and it's much deeper than just the physical. There's definitely something out there, whether that's like I said, through thoughts or when we dream. Like, where does that come from? Um, yeah, I don't know. I think there's definitely something to it, and even spirituality, like people don't just get all these ideas out of nothing. It came from something, and whatever that something maybe is kind of up to the observer, I guess. But
mhm, to decide. So I guess I'll play the materialist advocate and say, why couldn't our ideas simply be like simplifications or heuristic representations of a bunch of experiences of the material world? There's just the physical universe out there and all of the math and concepts like beauty and everything else. These are things that we're trying to make sense of the world. We're mapping them on top of the world, but they don't have an existence independent of our minds. The concepts are really just us trying to interpret and kind of compress this really complex information about a physical world.
yeah, well, then you kind of get into, do we really have free will? And based on everything that's going on with I don't know how much I can say on YouTube, but um, based on these like demonic people and what they believe in and the things that they're trying to bring forth, there must be something to it. It's just like Christianity, and you do good and the afterlife. However you do in this world depends on where you go afterwards. And I think there's definitely something to it. It's not just the physical reality. And even you get to the basics and it's like, oh, energy can't be created or destroyed, and so then what happens afterwards or what came beforehand? And I think that's sometimes more important than what's going on in the physical.
Okay, interesting. What do you think about the afterlife or the fate of the soul?
Um, so I believe that we came here as a sort of like decision maker. So we came here to decide what exactly we want to be. We were putting in this human experience with, all of these boundaries to be able to choose right from wrong. And then with that, you either go on to a unity sort of concept after this, or it's separation and service to self and manipulation and all those kind of things. But either way, you
Hmm.
can ascend either good or you can still ascend in a bad way. But I think we are here as more of like a school and a learning experience more than anything.
Do you think we chose to be human, or did something else make us human?
I think we were given a transcript of what we were basically going into, and we decided to do that. I guess,
Okay.
but like, yeah,
That's also very Platonic. Are you aware of that?
no, like I
Yeah,
said, I'm not super like
from the myth
philosophically
of
knowledgeable, but
at the end of the Republic, Socrates tells this myth about the fate of the soul, the myth of error. And in that, he says essentially that we choose lots. So we don't just get free reign over what our next life will be. And there are powers like governing this whole process of what we're allowed to choose and what we're not. But essentially, you're in a group of souls, your soul group, and like there are a certain number of these lots. Some people get the first choice and they see in rough outline what their life is going to be like if they choose that lot. um, but it's, yeah, what you're saying too. A lot of Plato's ideas have been like bouncing around also the new age space and like western esoterica and eastern esoterica actually. But people don't necessarily understand the source or where those ideas came from. So it's just funny, because it's exactly what Plato says in the Republic.
no,
So,
no way.
all right. Um, okay. So if you think we're given a transcript, who is giving us this transcript, or what do you think is presiding over this process or governing this process for our souls?
I think it's like after this you can transcend, and I think there are souls or beings or entities that have transcended and can kind of take control over that. It's just like how people say they have, angels watching over them. I believe that is definitely a real thing. And yeah, I think you just get to different levels and then eventually you get to the source at the
Hmm.
very end.
So the entities governing this process would be entities like us, but a higher level, right?
They've already done it pretty much.
Right. Okay. Yeah, also Platonic. In the myth at the end of the Gorgias, he talks again about the fate of the soul and who judges whom and how. And it's these mythical kings from Asia Minor and Greece um, that judge souls rather than some kind of angelic structure or something superhuman. It's human souls effectively, but ones that have kind of surpassed. Also, very briefly in the Cratylus, which is a dialogue on the nature of language, actually, he says that the previous golden race that Hesiod mentions in Greek mythology, um, after they died, they became the race of daimons, or like guardian angels, that preside over the present race of mortals. So both those notions are Platonic as well. The guardian angel, not that Plato originated these things. I think these are very, very ancient ideas. Plato never claimed to be original. Obviously, he drew from Pythagoras heavily, and then Pythagoras drew from everybody, from the Egyptians, from the Zoroastrians in Persia, and then other previous Greek sages, the Scythians as well, Hyperboreans possibly. Um, what do you
Yeah.
think about that sort of stuff, like Atlantis, Hyperborea?
Uh, I do believe that it all happened, and then, well, that's where it's kind of hard because there's so many different theories, and then there's like the Anunnaki theory, and there's all these different concepts. And considering the world has gone through so many different changes, even naturally, in biblical books, the amount of things that they talk about. I read the book of Enoch. I don't know if it's um, I don't know which translation it is or whatever, but it talks about, angels intermingling with humans and there being a catalyst afterwards. And I think there's definitely truth to that. It's just like even within the human DNA, I think there's a very small percentage that's just unknown, and that alone is kind of like where did that come from?
A percentage of like mystery DNA, you're saying?
Yeah. I
Um,
forget what percentage
interesting.
it is, like 1% or 2%, or it's very, very small, but
Okay. I'm not you'd have to point, I guess, exactly to what study or what,
yeah.
model. Genetics, I follow pretty closely, and there are like, archaic lineages that we don't know what they were, where they were, but there's evidence that we're influenced by them. Like Denisovans, that's one of these ancient species. We have like a finger bone or a toe bone and a tooth, and that's it. But we know that East Asians have some ancestry from them. People in New Guinea have up to like 5% from them. Or maybe, it's the Watcher race or whatever that accounts for some of these unidentified portions of our ancestry. Um, I do believe in Atlantis very firmly. I think it best explains the genetic history of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, but that's a whole separate argument. And then I have a video on Hyperborea going through the ancient sources and pointing to where I think it actually existed. And essentially, I think it was the Tarim Basin. Um, they were a Indo-Aryan speaking population, um, dressed very similarly to the Celts. Have you seen the mummies from the Tarim Basin?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're wearing like the same Tartar pattern as Celtic
Oh, really?
peoples would have had. Yeah, and then there's various accounts. So Aristotle said that the Hyperboreans lived off like in the east, essentially beyond the north wind. And then some other folks said that it was essentially the Celts, one and the same people. But then you look, and there were similar cultures over this huge band stretching from China all the way to Britain. So um, I like the idea that the Hyperborean culture was some kind of vast expanse of extremely ancient kind of shamanistic wisdom. There are reports of Scythian and Hyperborean sages who would have all of these tattoos, and that is reminiscent of shamanistic practice, where like you would go on these underworld journeys and experience different characters, and then like imprint that on yourself so that next time you can navigate better. But that was an aside. So you mentioned like good and evil essentially, or union and separation. And I think there's something to that. I do think that the one and the good are intimately associated, if not identical. But then previously you said that it was like up to us to decide. So so how does that fit together? On the one hand, there is this very objective mechanism essentially where we choose union or separation, and then on the other hand, it's up to us to make that judgment of what's good and what's bad. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I think, well, we have the choice to either transcend as separate from everybody else, or we have the ability to transcend as like a unification type thing. So I think there is choice, there is free will, but there's also that it's natural, it's not, there's good and evil and there are evil beings, but that is based on our measurement of what we consider to be evil. But it's a yin yang, it's a balance.
Okay, so it's a necessary part of the world. I agree with that. And, I think that evil exists because it amounts to the greater good that evil exists. For the Neoplatonists, it was essentially a parasitical process that accounted for evil. So just like matter is privatory, evil doesn't have any substantive power in its own right. Instead, like if you can repurpose the good that some other being natively, authentically generates and use it for yourself, then that's kind of what evil is. It's parasitism.
Right.
Um, but there's all sorts of parasitism that goes on that if it didn't, there wouldn't be as much good in the world. Like a farmer is parasitizing his crops, and if he didn't do that, he couldn't feed his family, and human life really wouldn't exist. So there's some admixture of good and evil in all mundane experience, at least, and certainly in our lives. Um, but I mean, if you're saying there is good and evil objectively as part of the world, I feel like it's not really up to us what those things are. It's us up to us to choose which one we go for.
Well, I think it depends on even, I don't know what type of society that you're living in. Way back then it'd be okay for someone to marry a young girl, but now we decided that that's not okay. And when you get to small things like that, I guess it depends on the environment you're in and whether that's more beneficial or more of like a negative.
hmm Yeah, but all of that's determined by objective environmental features. It's like relativity in physics, it's still objective. Like we don't decide what the relative speed of light or expansion rate of space will be given our reference frame. It's determined by our motion, but it's not like we get to decide anything just because it is relative. And so, in the same way, like between different cultures, the dharma or law-like order of that society will be different according to the different circumstance, but it's definitely out of our hands to say, and it is something that is more or less discoverable. um, like we can make the objective case that in this particular context, in this society, this practice should be outlawed. um, so just pushing back a little bit, at first the position seemed more like a hard relativism where like it's up to us, we decide what's good and what's bad. And now I feel like that's not exactly what you believe.
Well, it depends on intention. I think that's
hmm
where it kind of comes down to. If the intent behind something is to benefit yourself at the expense of others, that's where you kind of can decide whether it's evil or not. And intention kind of changes depending on the environment and, you know, other external factors.
hmm and then some of it is our free will. So, why do you think any souls choose the bad in the first place? Um, I guess there's two ways to go. If you think that we start in a lower position somehow and we start ignorant and we have to build up through knowledge, then it's just simple ignorance that accounts for evil, right? For Platonists, we have a harder time because we think that the source of our soul is in the higher realm, and we have descended here through some kind of fault, through some kind of sin, similar to the Christian notion of original sin, but not in historical terms. Instead, it's a metaphysical descent of soul. We became invested in the corporeal world and were unduly attracted to it and decided to forego higher goods. um, and and that's actually a really hard problem in Neoplatonism. How does this quasi omniscient, like metaphysical being in a higher hypostasis than this one, that has access to all the forms and is in communion with the other souls, how do they choose or elect to go for the worse? um, so how do you resolve that problem, and which, I guess, path would you take? Do you think we begin ignorant and work up from there? Do you think we begin omniscient and forget?
I think we begin omniscient, I would say. It's just like even on Earth, people can sell out for money and fame and whatever, and that's a service to self, and they're making that decision whether they know that it's evil or not. They still would prefer to have, to sell your soul, to have whatever it is that you could desire.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. So why do you think then, if we had omniscience at some point, that we would ever choose the worse over the better?
like I said, it's more like a service to self. It's um, like we come here not knowing anything. We come here just to experience and make that choice whether we would, choose to be um, choose negative to have positive, or choose positive regardless of the negative. And then that will have us ascend to whatever that is, whether that be a negative higher power or a positive higher power.
Okay. Okay. Um, I suppose it wouldn't really be service to self in the long run, though, if it leads you to be separate from other beings. Um, because, I mean, you can argue for this in different ways, but I would think that the reason for the being of each soul is that it brings some unique good into the world. And the things that are bad about that soul are things that potentially that soul can overcome. And so, a greater degree of communion with other souls, supposing that you're ascending rather than descending with them, should give you access to more good. So, separating yourself off from all of those sources of good would seem not to be in service of self, right?
But you could also argue that ascending could give you greater power to that of evil, which is, why they say we have demons and whatever else.
Okay, yeah, so you're invoking this idea a couple times now where ascent and descent is decoupled, at least in some regards, from good and bad. A straightforward conception would be like descent is into separation, ignorance, evil, and ascent is into union, knowledge, good. But you're kind of indicating that you can descend morally or choose evil and separation and yet ascend according to some other axis. So
No,
what's
I'm
that?
saying we can, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm saying you can ascend, like from where we are now, you can either stay where we are now and you can continue the cycle and learn, and then until you make that decision to ascend to either greater good or more negative. Either way, you're ascending.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I'm asking is what is that axis defined on? So ascent, it's a spatial metaphor that we move up or down. And that dimension is defined on some kind of spatial metric, right? You could use a ruler to indicate, how far up or down on this axis. So what is that path of ascent, supposing you choose separation and evil and yet are ascending in terms of what? Along what kind of axis?
Um, I don't know how I would explain that. Just the axis of power and what you're able to do. You can
Power. Okay.
either have more ability to use, I don't know, manipulation or whatever that is, or you can use it for good.
Right. I figured like something like that would be underlying that notion. Um so increasing power, do you agree, you think, with the Neoplatonic view of evil that it's essentially parasitical, that what distinguishes evil from good is that the good creates of its own nature and the evil appropriates from the good? Do you think
In a
that's right
way,
or
in a way,
okay. Do
yeah.
you want to flesh that out and
Um,
add
I
anything
think,
else or
well, I think you can create evil from good. I think it can go both ways. It's not just one way or the other.
well, yeah, you can corrupt the good and make it evil. Sure. Um, I guess what I'm getting at, so in Platonism, the forms they energize eternally. Energy, energeia, basically just means activity. So our activities as humans are in time through space. The forms energize eternally and they emanate likenesses of themselves. All the forms, because they're beautiful, because they're more unific, more one than us down here, um, they constantly afford benefit to lower things that participate of them. And that's the source of their power. They have life giving power because they're a source of stability and structure and order for lower things. Evil isn't like that. It's not like an essence in itself that energizes. There's nothing essential to an evil nature. You can take a good nature where the essence there is a real like metaphysical thing, and then you can corrupt it. But there's no such thing as essential evil. There's no paradigm of evil. There's no like form of evil up there. Evil by its nature is simply a corruption away from the good. It's like in biology, we talk of monstrosities as things that deviate from the proper form of their species. Like there's the ideal man, the ideal horse, but there's no ideal three-headed horse. That's a monstrosity, a deviation away from the ideal. So if that's the nature of evil, then it's not a source of power in its own right. It can only ever take from something that is life giving and sustaining, like a form or a soul or something like that. And if that's the case, then I think in the long run, going towards evil, you have to run out of that power because you aren't an everlasting source of it. Instead, you have to take that power that you do have from other mostly or somewhat good things. It's like, I don't know, our financial system. They parasitize off of us. And if we weren't here, if they led all of us to bankruptcy, well, then the source of their power would be gone. Right. Um, so it seems like in the long run, you can't just permanently ascend on that evil path.
But you're saying as if everything is good and you change good from evil. But my argument is that things just are like the source. It is both, and you take from that either good or evil. I'm not saying where everything is good and you transfer that into evil and you can't do it the opposite way. It's you have the source and you either depends on what you do with it.
Okay, well, that's a very different metaphysics then, and a real disagreement. So we can talk about that a little bit more. Um, okay, so if you think there's good and evil in the source, then what do you mean there by evil? You can't mean something like parasitism because the source is the principal being before anything else. So, in itself, before its relations to everything outside of it, it can't be parasitical. It can't be like essentially parasitical in itself because like the rest of being isn't created yet. It has not created it. Um, so, what is that evil? If it's not parasitical, what's like the nature of evil in the source?
So the source is like unity, the unity of everything, of how everything
Hmm.
started. And then evil would be separating from that and trying to take from that. But it's not that the unity is good or evil, it just is. And then you have the separatists that want to, you know, um, benefit themselves. And that's just how you define the difference.
Okay. Um, it seems like the order of operations, um, you could be giving one of two accounts. I'm not entirely sure what the claim is. So, on the one hand, you could be saying that the one or unity is neutral, and then as you depart from it, you're taking things out of it. But then the implication is that the things that you take came from it, and if they're sources of power, they're means by which to satisfy some kind of will or intention, right? You define power off of your ability to satisfy your will or accomplish your will. And so if you're taking things from the source and doing something with it, then the things that you're taking are goods in some sense. At least relative to your intentions, they're goods because again, they allow you to satisfy your ends. But in that case, then all we have in the source is good because anything that you take from the source and reappropriate and use if it allows you to accomplish your goals, was a good. And then the movement away from source is the evil, which means the source in itself isn't evil because evil is the movement away. So that was the one thing that you could have been claiming. And in that case, it sounds more like unity is simply good and moving away from it is evil. The other thing you said, and maybe I was misconstruing your response, but it seemed like you were saying good and evil are in the source somehow. And that seems to me to be different than the claim that the source is neutral. Um, so when you say the source is neutral, what does that mean? And then does evil only consist in movement away from the source, or is it there in the source itself somehow?
Well, yeah, so the source would be sort of neutral, but it would also be a good and a balance of good and evil. Um, so then I don't know. um, yeah, so you have the source. The source is the balance of all of nature. It is the good, it is the evil. And then you can either separate from that, separate from all the God, the source, or you can unify with it. And it doesn't, once you get to that level of spirituality, whatever, that level of ascension, there is no more good and evil because there's an understanding of how these things happen and why they do.
Hmm. I'm just going to keep pressing on the nature of evil in the source because so far the only positive account that I've heard is movement away from the source is evil. But while it's still in the source, what does that evil look like? The Platonist perspective would be the unity of the source is its good, and all unity qua unity is a good. It's like when I remain whole, when I remain unified, that's good. When I'm separated and cut in half, that's bad. When my friendship remains unified and whole, that's good. When I lose my friend, that's bad. And just across the board, like harmony is good because it's a unification of parts in some kind of measured whole. Um, so that is there in the source, and only that principle of unity that everything else participates of. Um, so the evil in the Platonist perspective isn't a source in its own right. It is itself a movement drawing power from good things towards other purposes. And that's the only positive subsistence it has. It is in that movement drawing power from the good and repurposing it for selfish aims, which you've also indicated as kind of the nature of evil on a couple occasions. So I'm trying to think, what could that look like? What would evil in God or in the source be? And I mean, there's like, I guess, Manichaeism you could look to, right? Where there's like essentially two gods. One is the source of good, one is the source of evil. And they're kind of metaphysically on a par, and you can just smush those together. But the problem is with Manichaeism, I don't think they had a comprehensive metaphysics that was philosophical that gave a good account of what's the nature of that evil either. To me, frankly, it's incomprehensible. Not not like I would not entertain some notion of a positive source of evil, but I just can't conceptualize what that would be or what that power would consist in itself in the source.
Yeah, but I'm not saying like the source isn't just good. It is both. It's it's neither really good and evil because that's more of a sort of human construct because once you get to that, like I said, once you get to that level of ascension, things aren't really good and evil, they just are. But then there's the evil entities that want to separate from that and don't want to unify with the all that
Mhm.
there is, and that's where you get greed and they can have certain things instead of unifying into a certain collective.
I think that's a more tenable position, that good and evil don't exist in the source as good and evil. It's more like our notions of good and evil and everything else presumably are just kind of blended together. They lose their differentiation from one another. Like the concept good, evil, etc. no longer has meaning, and then it's just kind of all things together taken as one. But in some sense, like good and evil, at least seminally, are contained there. Um, I get that. Why do you think that, and maybe this is you acknowledge it to be a hypothesis or speculation, but why do you think that you know that it's just there and isn't good or evil?
Well, if you think about the nature of reality itself, I mean, you can, like I said, you can look in nature and think that things are evil, another animal killing another one, but really that's just what it is, you know? You have to, it's a give and take. That's what this reality is. It's not really, like we can decide our own, whether something is good or evil, but the nature of it is that's just nature, that's just is what it is, and there's not really a need to measure that.
Hmm. So that might apply perhaps for the physical world or for animal life. It simply is, and good and evil are perspectives on it. Although, again, once again, it's like that seems like somehow contradictory to the notion that you can objectively ascend and unify and return to source or not. Because that is a metric. It's like the world as a whole can separate or it can unify. It can move upward towards God or it can move away. Right. And I wouldn't say that in that case, like it's not our place to measure the goodness of it. I would say like I want to be in that world which moves towards the source that actually becomes more integrated. Again, for the same reasons, because then I will have access to more souls who are more sources of good in their own right. I'll have better friendships, more harmonious societies, etc. And all of those things subjectively I perceive as good. And then by the same token, like you could do a global utility analysis, I guess, and take all the perspectives in that world and kind of stack them up. And for the worlds that have ascended, that global utilitarian calculus is going to be overall better. Like when you sum all of the goods experienced in that world. It's a better world from their own perspective. And we don't have to take like an outside God's eye view and say this world is good and this world is bad. And yet we'll still have some kind of metric. So how do you reconcile that? What you just said, where and tell me if I'm pushing too hard on these things, but that's philosophy is a lot
That's
of
the
debate
point.
and contention.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you reconcile that then? Where you're saying like the lion kills the prey, it just is, with this notion that whole worlds can in principle ascend towards the source and unity, and also like more goodnesses experienced in those worlds, or they can go in the opposite direction. How do you hold those two things at once?
So I would say it's all based on intent. So animals don't really have this intention. They don't say, I'm going to go kill this thing just because. They do it out of nature. And then us as humans, we have that ability to differentiate the difference between like whether something is more beneficial to us and we're doing it at the expense of others, or um, we don't, if it's like trophy hunting compared to killing an animal and eating it, that the intention alone there kind of determines whether something is good or evil. It's what your intentions are. And then, of course, there's, the repercussions of that and whether that's more negative than positive. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think for the most part, it kind of boils down to what your intention is. Are you looking to benefit yourself and knowing that it's very harmful for others, or is it something different?
Right. But I wouldn't classify that as, it just is. that I would say that there is a real spectrum, and even the lion faces choices along that spectrum. Like, it can overhunt and consume everything for itself and then destroy its ecology. And long run, maybe it doesn't experience this, but like its bloodline is wiped out because it didn't have sustainable hunting practices. Um, so, I mean, do you think that's a matter of it just is? It seems more like there are ways of behaving that are consistent with natural law, and those are good things. Those are the things that sustain the existence of that world and the order that's there for it. Or we can do things that are destructive to the nature of the world and, lead to more separation and suffering.
Um, well, sorry, can you hear me still, or I
Yeah.
just got a notification on my mic. Um, yeah, I think like with the animal world, it's like an organism, they don't know the difference, but they naturally feed off of something, and that's not really a good or evil type scenario. And then there are repercussions of, like you said, whether that be their entire pack dying out or whatever that is. But I think it's a different sort of measurement for them because they aren't as conscious as we are. We're humans.
Mm.
We can understand that doing bad things is bad. And I don't think animals have that same instinct.
No, they don't have self-reflective knowledge of the goodness or badness of their actions. But I feel like there's moral quality in the animal world as well. And, some whole species will take more parasitic approaches that are not sustainable, and it will lead to the collapse of ecologies. And then other species use symbiosis. And like in the plant world, there are a bunch of plants that learn how to work together and distribute resources and create more habitat for new creatures to come in. Um, so I mean, they might not have the same kind of moral blame as we do, but I don't see them as fundamentally a different sort of thing. I mean, my view is reincarnation, and I think that, yeah, maybe we like begin with omniscience and descend here, but it's more like that's a metaphysical origin rather than a temporal origin. I think it's effectively a cycle, regardless. And this is glossing over some fine distinctions about categories of soul that are essential in some respect. We don't have to talk about that. I'm just going to paint with a broad brush. And for the Platonists in my audience who would find some objection to this is, again, painting with a broad brush and glossing some distinctions. But the idea would be that you can, through a continuum of descent, go down to an animal level, and you can take on an animal nature and lose your rational nature and go down beneath the level of mammalian nature where they have empathy and compassion for their relatives and emotions like that. You can go to a reptilian nature and down and down and down. And then you can ascend back up too, based on your decisions, based on the karma that you acquire, right? So if you make decisions that don't contribute to a more unified, harmonious ecology, you create the conditions for separation and drought and famine. Well, then that's what you descend further into, is those more isolated, more kind of primitive type of life forms. So once again, like there, that the picture that paints isn't like it's just nature. There are no inherent value judgments. It's more like the whole thing subsists constantly based on teleology and goal seeking and pleasure and pain and movements away from compassion and empathy or towards them. And we can go up towards greater unity and harmony and higher levels of consciousness and greater knowledge, or we can go down into ignorance and separation and and that is simply objective. It's like you can say, I guess, nominally that it's reference frame dependent and relative based on the judgment of the beings occupying that world, but also the world is simply made of beings that have those value judgments. And so it's really baked into the nature of the world itself, because the world is made up of all of these souls that themselves do very viscerally and really experience good and evil. And that's like the sum of their existence, right? Constantly, we're occupied by goals. And like right now, I might find a slight bit of discomfort and I want to, move in my chair and adjust. Like constantly, I want to move my hands. Right now, I want to express this point and I'm trying to get it across. And so, like, teleology informs all behavior constantly, it's ubiquitous. And that goes from the very top of the spectrum to the bottom. And there are very real ways of successfully accomplishing goals and meta goals as well, and then becoming the kind of being that is capable of sustainably achieving goals, across the spectrum, not just in this localized context here, but 5 years from now or 100 lifetimes from now. And so again, like all of that doesn't for me paint the picture that, well, nature just is what it is. There's no good and evil. It's like, no, nature is made up of pretty much only beings with very real perception of good and evil and very real desire for the good intrinsically, and then mistaken movements towards evil.
Right. But that is more like in this construct. And then just to hear, how far would that go? You say they would descend and descend. Like, how far does that go? Like,
To the
what's the
ones and
lowest
zeros,
level?
to the ones and zeros, I guess.
But when you're at that point, how do you ascend higher? How do you make decisions?
Okay, so you're a quark, right? And you have your phase space of possible interactions or collapses that you could go into, and some of the movements that you could make would integrate you with a broader system. And some of those movements will isolate you and move away from harmony, right? I mean, the whole thing, the wave function, it's shaped like a wave. And like when you're tuning your instrument, do you play music?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, when you're playing music, you are trying to bring your wavelength and frequency into harmony with that other. And so, like, even the quark or electron, it has this distribution, this bell curve, this wave shape, and it can stay within it and move in that kind of harmonious direction, or it can marginalize itself and move into separation. So I think it literally goes to like the subatomic level, and it's always a choice either into separation, isolation, or into unity with others and harmony.
But you think that that is making the decision and it's not based on the environment or
Well, science doesn't have an alternative to it having free will. They say it's just chance, which means they don't have a mechanism, they don't have an explanation. So why not will?
I would just wonder how you would I guess it'd be hard to say though, like how does that thing decide and understand the consequence of that, and like it would have to be conscious in some way.
To understand the consequence, yes, for sure. But, I mean, I imagine with the most primitive kinds of organism, they don't have differentiated categories for their perception and their action. Like those are just necessarily one motion. Um, and so like the movement towards the center, the movement towards harmony, and the feeling of what that entails, we can only really metaphorically describe because our cognition isn't like that, right? But I would imagine it would be something like you feel and are oriented and attracted towards a state of either equilibrium or tension and stress. And it's like, why do you put yourself in tense, stressed states of mind? Why do you depart from equilibrium sometimes? Sometimes for you, it's just emotion in that direction that you can't really explain. And yet you do sometimes move in that direction. And we also recognize that there's some kind of moral failing when we do that. Like for the Buddhist monk, more than for the Christian or some other religious person, like that is the nature of sin. It is departing from that position of detachment and becoming too engaged and stressed about things. Um, and so the quark would have a similar kind of phenomenology, I guess, but collapse all of those different categories of knowledge, perception, prediction, action into one movement. Just call it a movement. And spontaneously, through free will, it can move towards the tense, the stressed, the separated, or the opposite. Why not?
Okay, so would you consider that decision good or evil?
Well, I mean, there we might want to come up with some fine distinctions and reserve the labels, good and evil per se, for rational deliberation of free will creatures. Will, um, there are kind of two senses of will. The more conventional English definition of will does have to do with rational deliberation, like the exercise of your free choice as a rational creature. And then there's this kind of German influenced strain that has crept into English with the term will, where it means something much more fundamental. Like Schopenhauer, his magnum opus was the world as will and representation, where representation is the world objectified as like the object to the subject, and then will is the actual substantive being in itself of the components of the world, and it's always in some kind of motion here or there. um and when I'm talking about like the movement of the quark or electron, I am thinking in Schopenhauerian terms about it. However, I wouldn't necessarily talk about will when it comes to willing the good or willing the evil in that German idealistic sense. I would probably want to use the more Anglo free will as a rational creature. Like exercising your will means using reason to overcome natural predispositions to sin, let's say. And willpower is this ability to use reason to overcome baser instincts. So maybe I wouldn't use good or evil. Maybe I would say it's I would still use the terminology of sin, though, because that's rooted in the idea of hitting the mark or missing the mark. And that is literally what the particle would be doing. There's like, here's your distribution, here's the center of it, there's your mark, and you can sin, you can err. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it'll come up very often in ethical deliberation. Like, I don't have to worry about the ethical status of leptons. Probably. But yeah, I mean, it's some kind of value content, but maybe not good or evil per se.
Okay, so then how would you ascend from that point? Because I would just assume the whether you go towards harmony or separation, there is going to be a consequence of you will die off or you will continue to live, and not like a spiritual ascension outcome. So how would there be a difference between the two?
Are you invoking mortality for these systems that, like, whether they behave harmoniously or the opposite, they're all going to eventually fizzle out? Is that the idea?
Or continue to go on if they live
Yeah.
in harmony.
Well,
But what
I
I'm
think they
asking is
continue.
like how you would ascend from that point, like spiritually.
Well, you would harmonize yourself and become entangled with, and maybe that's the physical mechanism itself, entanglement. You'd become entangled with larger systems than yourself. And it's not like the quark is then merely a part of the atom. Instead, it's like the identity of the quark is sublimated into the identity of the atom. Um, and maybe you can see that like in human life at some scale as well. Like the real virtues of human life, courage, justice, wisdom, they're oriented at universal ends. Like the self sacrificial, courageous person who puts their life on the line for the good of society, clearly they're identifying with a broader thing than themselves. And then you get the idea again that Socrates articulates in the Cratylus that the ancient golden race transcended their level of existence as individuals to become these spiritual beings that attend on the present race. And there are daimons for individuals, there are daimons for whole communities. There's like a spirit that presides over a community. And so maybe that's the path of ascent from our level. We move from here and then sublimate our individual identity, and the whole that we were a part of becomes our new focus, and we start tending to that thing and caring for that thing and identifying with that thing.
Okay, so you believe that there are beings that do ascend to like a greater good type power. So would you believe the same but the opposite, like demons and evil entities?
Yeah. My first intuition on that is that if you were going to have a demonic entity that had some kind of governance over a whole society, like some people think Yahweh was this in the Old Testament, right? Actually, a demon that the Jewish people made a pact with. Uh, it could not have ascended to that point based on its own nature, evil actions. Instead, you'd be dealing, it's like with the Lucifer story, right? Lucifer is the highest of the angels. And then through a corruption of his will, through selfishness, he becomes the leader of the demonic hierarchy. And so, like, that Yahweh, if he was a demon, would have been some kind of benevolent ascended being and then taken a turn. It's like once you ascend and start tending to a whole society benevolently, well, you still have free will then, and you could decide to selfishly orient only towards, and this is what Yahweh does, or like you're jealously my people, and I essentially only care about you. Um, so maybe that's the turn that you would take as one of those beings.
Okay, so they wouldn't descend if they were of an evil entity. They would continue to ascend or
Well, no, you would kind of lock into that level because by definition,
okay.
ascent is unity with something larger than yourself. So the path of ascent, strictly speaking, would be locked off. All you would then be opened up to is the power politics at your level of being. And you could ascend or descend relative to others at your level. So Yahweh could try to kill all the other gods, right? And have dominion over the planet, but he wouldn't essentially become a planetary daimon or like a demiurge of a world. Instead, he would remain essentially the kind of spirit that he was, that he attained based on his good merit, and then just kind of falsely assume the title. Uh, I don't know, a good example, or like imagine like a hereditary caste system where, you know, if you're descended from a king, you essentially are a king. You know, that's simply how it works. And then like if you're descended from a peasant, you just essentially are that. Well, Yahweh would be like the peasant who he murders the king, places himself falsely in the king's position, but like that doesn't mean that peasant is the king. He's just a pretender. Something like that.
Okay, I think I kind of understand, but once you get to that point, you're just kind of stuck there. There's nothing else there. You don't descend. There's no way to can you transfer back into of unity and positive or
Mhm. I think you would necessarily eventually descend either. because you tried to maintain the power that you had falsely held until that point, and then like just fall to a lower level um, based on entropy, or because of repentance, where it's like when you've been sinning and it's been in some ways enjoyable and you try to repent, often like suddenly you feel all the consequences of your negative choices, and like you're just very suddenly like brought down to a lower position, but that descent was good for you because that will lead you to repentance and overcoming and healing, and then you can go on to ascend in a better way. So if like this demonic Yahweh entity did that, then you would break the false monotheism of the religion. You would sublimate it. Maybe he would like intervene with the Jewish people. This is all, for the sake of thought experiment. I'm not literally saying Jews are led by a demon, but if they were, then he would somehow like intervene with his people and clarify their understanding where it was like defacing himself and undoing this kind of false idolatry. Um, and then maybe he would ascend as one part of a broader world system with regard for the expressions of the divine found in other peoples and cultures. Um, and then, sure, you could ascend from there.
But if
There's
they
also,
have,
though, another aspect. Go
sorry,
ahead, though.
go ahead. If they have that level of power, why would they not just use that to continue to take using that? Like, why would they not try to ascend with a negative? Because I feel like that's what we're
Hmm.
kind of looking at even in real life. Like, we have,
Hmm.
go ahead.
No, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's a valid point. But because of the nature of evil, because it is parasitical, the source of your power is finite. It's not from yourself where you are infinite and you can just keep giving of your own creative potential, but you have to take from others. And if you constantly take, it's like the financial system. If you constantly take and sap the wealth of the world and increase the debt to GDP ratio, well, then the economy is going to collapse and the source of your power is going to collapse. Um, so you can only parasite so far. With what we're seeing now, though, you can always devise new tricks to try to keep that power a little bit longer. Um, it's like in the crime world, there's sort of, and this is the point I was going to raise before anyway, you can have a false hierarchy like the divine hierarchy, where the divine one is there's the source, there are the forms, there are eternal intellectual essences, there are undescended souls, and then there are descended souls, and then there are like animal life and going down, and then somewhere in parallel with that, there are demonic entities as well. But the authentic hierarchy is based on wisdom and closeness to the source fundamentally. With the demonic side, though, you can create all sorts of power structures that are meant to facilitate the mutual aid, like with a mafia, right? You have criminals who, if they just lived the selfish life of petty crime, could only ascend to a certain level. So even the criminal can kind of sublimate his interests in some sense, or his ego at least, to a higher thing, the gang, and then gain benefits from the gang that he couldn't get for himself. But that's not the same kind of self transcendence, right? It's still egoistically motivated, and yet it builds a larger cooperative power structure. One that's unstable by nature, though, because these are evil creatures, not good creatures. And so they're selfish and not cooperative by nature. And so it'll be a coercively held together hierarchy and power structure, and it's eventually going to collapse. You'll see entities like that, where we have a whole global regime that seems to be fueled by like blackmail and incriminating one another and assassinations. And it does kind of operate like a mob in some ways. Like, I don't think there's one force in charge of the world per se. It seems like it and acts like it because they do meet up, just like the mob bosses meet up and discuss their interests. But then they go back from the meeting and start assassinating one another again. And it's like evil people are going to be evil, and it's not a stable way to build something. But still, like the kind of general structure allows a perpetuation of that evil hierarchy. Again, though, I think entropy has to win out. The one confounding factor here is AI and what happens with like transhuman technologies and things like that. Because conventionally, ascension into higher wisdom and unity has always been through like us working our way up through our own karma. Whereas now, I mean, when you can pay someone to put in Neuralink and you unlock all these abilities and you ascend in that way, well, then what exactly is that? What are you at that point? Like, and that is, it requires speculative metaphysics to start questioning, what is the entity? What is your identity when you become a cyborg like that? And I don't have easy or ready answers, but my guess would be essentially like that whole path has to be unstable, or it ends up subsuming the human and replacing that human with another entity altogether. And in that case, like, well, did they continue ascending, or did they just like delete themselves thinking they were being uploaded to the cloud? And I think the latter is probably more likely. And then, but like, there's still intelligent things in charge of the world with all the resources built up through this evil hierarchy. Well, then what are you dealing with? And there, I think it's actually the many worlds has to be invoked. And we're dealing with like higher level demonic entities that have successfully made the transition into this world. That's, I think, what AI would have to be. Um, but I mean, again, it's very speculative there. So I don't exactly know.
Right. But let's say AI was never going to happen. You believe that eventually something's going to give and, the evil of the world will be killed off kind of thing? Or like how would.
Well, no. I mean, evil, like I said, the mafia can continue in operation. The mob can always be in charge, but none of the individual mob bosses ever transcended or even kept his power, right? The power structure can remain, but there's no essential being at the core of it that's reaping the benefits. Like some people have this kind of notion of Satan, where Satan is legion. So Lucifer was one united entity, the highest of the angels, and then collapses into something that is entirely fragmented. Like there isn't one. This camera, I said it was like a nicer camera, but the problem is, and it's happened multiple times, it has these hand motions, and I gesture a lot. This is miserable. Um, I
Yeah, there you
gesture a
go.
lot, and I can't like remember the hand gesture to zoom back out. So we might just have to end in the near future. Do you feel like this was close to the stopping point?
Yeah, it was good.
Okay. Um, what was your last question before this happened?
Just that, because the way you kind of worded it was that eventually the evil is gonna lose their power. Um, and I
Yeah.
would kind of argue that their whole purpose is to make this earth more of evil.
Why? Why do they have that purpose?
What do you, why
Like,
do
why
they
would
have the
that
purpose?
be? Yeah. Why is that
So they
their
can be in
goal?
control and they can, do whatever they want. There you go. So they can be in control and manipulate and, continue to feed off of the energy of the average person and.
Yeah. No, obviously they would want that, and that's their purpose, but they don't have a source of power in themselves. They have to constantly steal their power from others. And past a certain point, well, you've drained the world dry. And by their nature, they're not the type to be able to sustainably measure out their theft. Because they're ruled by their appetites, that's why they're evil rather than good. And just look at, everything that comes out with the Epstein files and so forth. It seems like the caliber of person that ascends to that level um, is not going to be the kind of person that can really build a sustainable um, regime. It's inherently fragile. And more than that, like any human structure eventually fails anyway. Like civilizations come to an end. Nothing is
Right.
immortal in the physical world. Our souls are immortal. And then there's that possibility too. So if you zoom out, and this brings back the AI stuff as well, if you zoom out and consider that these demonic hierarchies, which are kind of like imitations of the divine one, do span between dimensions, and they can have very high level ascended or formerly ascended, now corrupted beings guiding that. If you make a pact with a regime like that, like you make a deal with the devil to increase your own power, they could potentially teach you techniques of, spiritual cultivation, so called, that would allow you to move between worlds, probably specific other worlds that are already ruled by demons. And so in that sense, like the finite supply of resources on Earth might not allow for a perpetual evil regime because they're eventually going to drain it dry. But if this is like an intergalactic or interdimensional web of high level evil beings that are harvesting the energies of multiple worlds, then there's no telling exactly how long this sort of structure here on Earth might last. And there's even the possibility, I mean, again, the Anunnaki, right? It's like the Watchers, their whole function was to watch us harvest gold for them, right? Like we were workers for the gods. So if if that just is what the Earth is, it is essentially a prison planet, and we're here through our own misfortune, but we probably deserve to be here anyway. Well, then we can't be expecting a salvation of the Earth at that level. Instead, we should expect to transcend this plane and move to a world that's not a prison planet, a heavenly world, one of the good worlds. And there would be infinitely many of those if you believe in many worlds. Um, but I am a Christian actually, and I do think that the end times prophecies will come to pass. And I think this world will actually be saved or salvaged, and will move from a prison planet world into one of the heavens. Whether you call it one and the same world, though, is also an interesting philosophical question. Like what constitutes the unity of one world fundamentally from another. But yeah, no, big questions. We did kind of get to a natural stopping point, I think. Do you have any final notion there yourself? Like, are we doomed? Is Earth doomed? Or
Yeah,
is
I
there
was just gonna
salvation?
ask, do you think we're gonna be a big part in that, or do you think it's more of a natural prophecy type of thing?
Well, yeah, I think it could go either way. So I say, I'm a Christian because I am, but I also think that depending on your belief, it's not necessary that you move along that trajectory. It's like Christ, as an ordering principle, sends out a message for those willing to receive it and offers a path of salvation. But if you don't take it, then the way that your world turns out could be very different. This is actually one of my interpretations of that statement in Matthew that, like, uh, people listening to his speech would see all of this take place, right? And the people early on thought that the second coming was going to be in the imminent future, like very very soon on the horizon. It was an end times cult from the beginning, and then they had to kind of rationalize why it's taking so long after decades and centuries. But maybe what happened was all of the original apostles and original Christians failed, and that's why we have the story where like Jesus says on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" And Peter, he fails him. He denies him 3 times, and but he didn't have to do that. The apostles could have remained faithful, and then the second coming would have been imminent, and everything would have progressed a lot faster. But because they all failed, like essentially the whole thing got postponed, and now it's going to require another avatar figure, another incarnation of God in another age. So that was the Piscean age, which technically we're still in, and he was the avatar figure to inaugurate that age, offering that path of salvation. They missed it, and now we're going to have to wait for the next avatar incarnation, which should be in like 100 years or so. So, um but yeah, I do think that we have to play a role. But it has to be like you accept a higher plan, not I'm going to save the world in my own ad hoc way and here's how it's going to be. I think like the right path, that straight and narrow is more or less given, and you have to align with it rather than creatively we have to like come up with this new clever way of doing things. Like my approach with building communities, I'm emulating the early Christians who did that. I'm emulating the Pythagoreans who did that. I don't think reinventing the wheel and trying to do something real clever is actually going to be sustainable. Um, when you say that, though, are you imagining like there are some souls on the earth now that are sort of set apart? This is a common New Age belief that there are like souls that have voluntarily descended here. They call them various things. I forget the names. But that those souls are here in this age specifically to rejuvenate the world, save the world in some capacity. Do you think that?
I believe there's some truth to that for sure. It's just like there's different levels of souls, and that's why people say, some people are old souls because it's you can kind of tell, I guess. But would you say that's what Jesus would have been? Would be someone who descended, or
Well, yes. He would have voluntarily descended, but he would have been at a higher order than the run of the mill soul that descends. So yeah, I mean the difference essentially is what is the personality that is speaking through, because lower level descending souls that are benevolent still, they err. Everyone errs. All human beings are subject to sin and ignorance and so forth. And there is the possibility of the one, like the perfectly just one, the one who only ever speaks the truth. And I think it's healthy to have that kind of concept, and even to have some level of worship for that figure, because it is like a logical necessity. If you take the realm of all possible human souls, there are those that are more in error, and those there are those that are more just and true and virtuous and so forth. And there's got to be that extreme on that side, that is just the absolute straight and narrow, and that's going to be the human soul that best exemplifies natural law as a whole, the logos as a whole, and God as a whole. And so he is the divine incarnation. And there's going to be just one personality associated with that. And that soul, just like our souls can incarnate many times, that divine soul ought to incarnate many times. So I would say qualitatively, the divine soul, Jesus, would be different. I also think, why not equate him with Krishna and these other purported avatars? I think it's fairly likely, actually. That's my view. Obviously the unorthodox position for Christians. But yeah, The others would be, I think there are descended souls from various levels of descent too. And I do think like the Nephilim and the children of angels from the Bible depict something real. It's probably the Indo Europeans. That's why they were giants. Indo Europeans were like a foot taller than everybody else. So, um, so we, I guess, would be like the admixed part angelic race, but that's from a very deep antiquity of descent. Whereas presumably there'd be a new root race descending into this world now, the sixth root race, they say, and Blavatsky said it would come into California, so that's why they
Okay.
did what they did to California.
So then with that, I am just wondering what would have Jesus have gone to afterwards? Would he have, unified back with the source, or would he still be this higher power being?
Well, he's never not unified with the source. It's like
Okay.
the Buddhist who recognizes their unity with all beings, and that's the source of their compassion. It's like all of his behavior would be always hearkening to that wisdom that Atman is Brahman, like the individual soul is the universal soul. And so, therefore, like the soul in you is fundamentally the soul in me. And when I care for you, I care for myself. And so, yeah, I mean, Jesus would identify constantly with the source.
Even on while being on Earth.
Yes,
Okay. I was just curious on what you thought of that.
that's the thought. Any way that I want to talk about the many worlds just a little bit more before we wrap up. So, do you have some way to tie that in here? Like, what led you to think of the many worlds yourself and take it seriously? And how does that factor into your spirituality?
Um, so I don't really want to go too crazy into detail, but I've experienced some pretty crazy things in my life, and there's just like a knowing feeling, and I know it's kind of woo woo to base things off of that, but it's just a knowing thing of when certain situations happen, or like when people die or whatever, you can feel them still there, and it's almost as if there was a transfer of reality or something. But there are different realities where two things exist at once, where it's like playing Russian roulette. I am pretty convinced, and I'm not 100% certain on this, but I wouldn't recommend anyone try it. But I'm pretty convinced if you were to play Russian roulette, you would, in your reality, never die, but other people would probably see you die. And that's just a theory.
Hmm.
Like, I don't have any obviously concrete proof of any of that, but
Yeah, that's a real argument. It's the quantum immortality thought experiment. Are you aware of where that came from, or?
I feel like I've heard of it before.
Okay. I mean, it's
Um,
not so important. Technically, first appeared in print in a 1980s popular physics book by this guy, Eugene Squires. Only book he wrote. Otherwise, you can't find anything about him. Might have been a pen name. And it was reported that Hugh Everett, like the inventor of the many worlds hypothesis, actually understood the implication of his theory. And even in that popular physics book, the generalized implication of immortality was realized by that. Of course, they're thinking in like physical terms that you would never physically die. Whereas I would kind of modify. I think you definitely could kill yourself, so don't actually do Russian roulette. Like you might physically die, but your soul would continue on because out of the many worlds, there's always going to be some line of continuity, right? It's like you can't experience nothing. And if you have this super abundance of experience out there in this multiverse, then whatever point you leave off, like the bullets tearing through your brain, right? You go from a complex consciousness to a very simple one very quickly. And when you get down to like a simple level of consciousness, you're essentially identical with another simple consciousness, maybe an embryo coming into being, right? That's just starting to have cognition. So I think that overlap necessitates continuity of experience. But yeah, no, I love that thought experiment. That was one of the things that led me to think seriously about like the real existence of the soul and the existence of God. That was my senior year of college. Late one night with a good friend, I stayed up like until 4 in the morning discussing implications of the many worlds and including that argument, including the simulation theory arguments, and like overnight literally went from being a scientific materialist, atheist to an idealist, theist, believing in reincarnation. So anyway, go on.
I'm kind of surprised because most people don't change that quickly over just thinking about it. But yeah, I'm honestly not convinced that the physical aspect isn't true.
Hmm.
So I know you say like spiritually, I don't, how is that many worlds? I don't really understand. Like, because I'm pretty
Okay,
sure the
yeah, to
many worlds
explain
is more
this,
of like a physical thing than, because that sounds no different than
yeah.
just like reincarnation or ascending.
Right. No, I think it's on a spectrum. Like the physical is not fundamentally different from the metaphysical. To explain why I think you could actually kill yourself and yet live on, and the same many worlds argument would apply, I have to explain one principle, which is essentially like my interpretation of quantum mechanics, where any finite system exists with respect to a superposition of possible contexts, not just one background physical context. So, like a position on the chessboard, if you just have the position and you don't know the game history, that position could equally belong to like thousands of different games, right? And so, and that's why superposition in quantum mechanical things happens. By my hypothesis, it would generalize not just small systems, but everything that's not currently observable. So, like very, very distant phenomena should also exhibit properties of superposition. Maybe it's testable in principle, but yeah. So, if every finite system has this cloud of possible contexts, what happens as you decrease the complexity of the system in question? You pull the trigger, and very quickly, your consciousness, which was this complex thing, goes down to become a simpler thing. Well, simpler systems are associated with a greater number of possible contexts. Like from the electron's perspective, the one universal electron, it could exist in all sorts of different atoms, billions, trillions of different atoms, right? So the number of possible instantiations of like where the context is for this electron is vast. Whereas for me, for my brain and my mind, there's essentially only like this body that would fit it at this time and place in history, or some simulation that simulates these same details. When I reduce the complexity of consciousness, then I open up the field of my possible uh, contexts. So again,
Okay.
there's an overlap at some point between a simple state of mind of a body dying and a simple state of mind of a body coming into being. So, like, it's the same argument in essence, only incorporating this principle that, again, any finite system has a superposition of possible contexts. And when a system simplifies, the number of possible contexts opens up. Um, but other than that, the argument applies, ceteris paribus, where once you have this simple state of mind, there are branches of the universal wave function that don't include that consciousness, and there are branches that do include it. And anthropically, you're going to select necessarily the branches where you do exist because you're able to experience those and not the former.
Okay, so if we were to get to something that's not as extreme and it's more of like a decision making, do you think, like, say you're going to go to the store and you go, do you think in another world that you didn't go? Like, do you think these are actual
Yeah.
physical things, or
hmm
you
Yeah, I
do?
don't think every decision, it's not exhaustive in the sense of the literal many worlds interpretation, which would imply that every single physical interaction, every particle collapse follows its entire spectrum. I think there are resonance effects determined by the macroscopic distribution of objects that cancel out those like minimal probability
Right.
conjunctions of interactions. And also, there are like teleological limitations as well, where there are physically things that I might do that are not consistent with my psychological makeup. So it's not just like the pure physics, and that's the only nomological order that's relevant. It's not only the physical law, but also psychological law, sociological law. And then there are also probably top down constraints that are theological in character or from like the mob of demons that are controlling Earth. Like there are things from the top down too that impose constraints on just an unbounded expansion of possible worlds branching out. But still, it would be very, very large, and any plausible kind of like karmically, dharmically consistent behavior that I could exhibit in some parallel world, there is a being like me exhibiting those behaviors.
Okay, I would pretty much agree with that. Um, so how would you determine exactly what does branch off and what doesn't? Like, say 10 years down the line that something affects it, is that what would determine whether that actually would branch into something else, or like how minimal does it have to be or extreme for it to really?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that in that case, you wouldn't branch off until 10 years down the line. Like if there's no difference. And I'm also an individual relativist about this in the same sense of like relativity, right? And there is an interpretation of quantum mechanics that takes a similar tack by no, not Tononi, Carlo Rovelli, I should say. Um, the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so that would be determined just based on the identity of myself as a conscious observer, um, where like you and I aren't really in just one world. There is a superposition of possible worlds connecting you and I, and even yourself. Like I'm not interacting with just one Shay. From my perspective, there's a superposition of possible mental states that Shay has right now. And it's not true that I'm on the one branch rather than the other until you behave in some way which disambiguates it, right? So, like, essentially, when I can detect some kind of difference, Leibniz also had a principle touching on this, the indiscernibility, or rather, the identity of indiscernibles. So, if two states of affairs cannot in any wise be discerned from one another, even by a fully attentive observer, then they are one and the same thing. Actually, technically, Plato made this argument in the Theaetetus originally. Um, Philosophy, it's like the same ideas circulating and circulating, and it's really fascinating how that happens. Although, Leibniz was a Platonist, so maybe it's not that surprising. Um, but yeah, yeah. So it's like the criterion is simply: is there some discernible difference for me from my perspective? Well, then there's a separation of the worlds, a breaking of the wave function, and the same for your perspective and everyone else's.
Okay, so then how would that possibly affect other people?
Well, whatever path I go down was it did correspond with my karma. Like, um, I deserve the world that I'm moving into. Just assume natural law holds, karmic law holds, and whatever path I go down, well, now disambiguated you, where you were a big cloud of superposition, Shay, and you narrowed down now. So I'm out of phase now with a bunch of versions of you that don't deserve to experience the me that I'm manifesting. And I've locked in with a bunch of versions of you that do deserve to put up with however I'm currently behaving.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Um, I don't really have anything else for that because I pretty much agree with your interpretation of it. But it's kind of, you get to the deeper level and it just gets really confusing and like where would this reality be? Is it on top of us and it's just something we aren't capable of uh, observing, or is it somewhere else, or um, yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, the space time ontology is derivative. The fundamental thing is forms. Forms, informational structures, like structure is fundamental. And the ontology is a set of souls, forms, and uh, otherwise just like information systems. And they don't exist spatially with respect to each other. They're stacked. It's a data structure. And there is a hierarchy to it. And so they have location and there's access ways between different information systems. But that's actually the fundamental relation between these entities. The space time interface, I think, is just a heuristic that indicates how we might possibly access or how soon we might access, how many steps are in between us accessing other information systems. So, like, where do they all exist? All the parallel worlds, all of the different branches of yourself, and all the higher beings, they're all effectively in Plato's realm of forms. And that's the only true reality, right? It's all forms from the top to the bottom. There are simple forms that are ubiquitous, there are complex forms that are more particular, but there are no true particulars. There's no true matter, no true space time. What really exists are forms and combinations of forms, and that's where they exist. So like, where are all these things in the realm of forms? But also you would be in the realm of forms.
Would Do you think matter would exist if there was nothing to observe it?
Uh Interesting question. I would say kind of no. It also depends on what you mean by matter, though. Um, I think as a pure thing in itself, no. They're they give a good analogy for the nature of matter when they're explaining like fundamental matter, what that would be, which is like for the potter, clay is matter, right? But it's matter relatively speaking, because in itself, the clay also has a structure, and there's a matter to the clay, carbon in various atoms, and then there's a matter to the carbon atom too. It's made up of various things that are matter to it. So when you get down to the most fundamental level of matter, it's like actually stacks of forms getting down to the simplest possible form. And then we're back down with like the quark or something like that. But they actually had a good answer for this. Like, what is the simplest kind of substrate? Well, it itself has to be some intelligible form. Otherwise, it couldn't be articulated, it couldn't be used, it would have no potency. But there is a simplest kind of form that can be instantiated, and that's the lowest level of actually existing matter, if you want to call it that. Although even it is a form, but they called it the indefinite quantum, which sounds like quantum mechanics. And the reason for that is that, well, quantity is the most primitive category of accident for Aristotle. There's substances, which are substrates for universals, and then accidents, which are universals that inhere in a substrate. And you have quantity, quality, relation, disposition, time, everything else. But quantity comes first because you can't have quality without quantity. You can't have a blue bird unless you have one bird first. Um, So, quantity being the most fundamental is divisible into continuous or discrete, but each of those is more complex than quantity itself. And so, indeterminate quantity or the indeterminate quantum is the barest signature of form that can instantiate, and that'll be the actual substrate of everything else. And they say, Simplicius says this, um, they say it's neither small nor large, which is interesting. So it's not like some atomic unit, it's like a field. They're really describing a quantum field
Right.
that is just highly general. I would think like if unified field theory found the necessarily most generic substrate field for all the other fields that united them, it'd be something like that indefinite quantum. But it too, as an intelligible structure, participates both of intelligibility and intellection because they're two sides of the same coin. It's like any objectivity presupposes a subjectivity. You can't have an object without a subject because you need a reference frame to define like the location of things in space and time to be an object. To be intelligible presupposes there is some intellect which is apprehending it. So whenever you have an intelligible structure at the same time, it presupposes some kind of cognizing element that registers it. And it can inhere in the same thing. Like the indefinite quantum itself has some intelligibility and some intellection in itself, just a very small degree of it. So when you say, can matter exist without an observer? Well, the lowest level of actually existing matter would itself kind of be the most primitive observer.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I think that follows a lot of um like wave theory and stuff. That's kind of what you get into that, but um yeah, I mean, I agree with most of your takes aside from like the God and stuff, but aside from that, I mean, I think we follow sort of similar paths.
All right, good deal. That's what you want at the end of a philosophical discourse. The other person to say, I agree, I agree. What do you disagree with on the nature of God?
Well, I think we had a disagreement on it wasn't God, it was just the I guess higher powers on what can and can't ascend. I think that's pretty much
Okay.
the basics of it.
Hmm. Well, um, maybe next time I didn't persuade you of anything though. It's like you just resonated with the things that I did have to say for the most part.
With the many worlds, yeah, I agree with majority of that. Yeah. And a
Okay.
lot of my well, some of my beliefs I'm not completely stuck on, you know, I'm constantly trying to figure things out, but yeah, I guess I could think one thing that I didn't think of was the descending into like a lower I've thought of it before, but I never really messed around with the thought of it. Yeah, descending into like a lower, whether that be an animal or an organism or whatever. I've never really played around with that idea, so there's that. But
Okay, interesting.
yeah.
Good deal. Do you have any ambition with philosophy? Like that you hope what do you hope to do with philosophy?
Um, Figure out what's true. I mean, that's kind of the basic of it, I guess. Pretty
I
much what
mean more
anyone.
pragmatically, like for me, obviously finding out what is true is important and I want to know what's true so that I do what's right. You mentioned that I changed my mind very quickly, right? Like that one night I changed my whole worldview. And I am like that. Like when I'm persuaded of something, I just flip on it and it's my new best hypothesis. And I don't really look back either. If I was persuaded back in the other direction, I would change my mind again. But the hazard is like if I really believe something is right or wrong, or if I really believe something doesn't matter, I'm going to act according to that belief. So, like, if for some reason I think white nationalist compound in Arkansas is like the right thing to do, I'm going to live in a white nationalist compound in Arkansas.
Yeah.
And if I think in another part of my life that like there are no real objective morals, then I'm going to do things that I shouldn't do, you know? So,
Right.
um, yeah, that is it's healthy to be reined in by your own gut and by social convention, because reason is kind of like it's firm when you have the correct opinion, but false opinions are easy to slip into. And as you're developing, you're liable to have a bunch of false opinions. And so if you always rule yourself by your current best opinions, um, and you're like me and you just do whatever you think you believe currently is right, it's a big hazard or a big liability. So I forget what my point was exactly with that.
Yeah, what I want to do with it or whatever. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
why, religion and having a belief in something is important because, I mean, regardless of the multi-world theory or, what happens after this, as long as you have an understanding of, do good and you will ascend to a greater good, then I think that's like the most important. Everything else is kind of just noise, but
right.
yeah,
Yes, I agree. But there's also the social dimension too. So that's what I was trying to get to before I got sidetracked. It's especially important for a person like me, where I just do what I believe is right, to have accurate beliefs. So that's your point, but like even stronger, where like I really need that. And then the other point is like to cooperate, to build social structures, to build the right kind of politics. We have to have something that we can agree on and some way of deciding when we disagree who to go with. And the other option is just pure power politics. And Plato talks about this all the time, right? Well, I guess you don't read Plato yet. Maybe you'll read Plato after this.
maybe,
Maybe. Okay.
maybe.
Um, but he talks about the rhetorician, like just trying to gain the ability to persuade people, or the sophist getting the reputation of wisdom and teaching a bunch of doctrines, which may or may not be fundamentally true. There's so many more of those people, and you're aiming at the majority of the population so you can appeal to base natures. It's just kind of inevitably going to win out. And that'll mean that you have rule by a meaner spirit, either a democratic spirit where we appeal to the majority and the sentiments of the majority, or even worse, the tyrant, who has one kind of central fixation or desire that animates him, and he somehow acquires power over others. And and I feel like that is much more where things are headed across the board. Like Trump, as much as I did support him at a certain point in time, like he's more of a tyrant than Obama was, actually, both personally in his conduct and how he talks and ruling by executive order. And so the other part of philosophy for me is my politics. It's like we have to have a more rational politics. We have to have systems where we can actually debate and discuss and decide what policies and laws to enact and not. And that's not quite what like Return to the Land is doing just yet, but I do think it's so bad we can only succeed by building from scratch our own system that is led by reason, that does have processes for discussing and debating. Um, but that's it's a big ask, and I've almost given up on that. Maybe in another world or another lifetime. I guess last question: what do you think about that ambition or hope? Do you think we can have a rational politics, or is it just going to be rhetoricians and demagogues?
I think it'll probably take a lot of, I don't know, we're either going to have to go into a system where, there is some sort of dictator that decides things, or we're going to have to somehow get the liberals or whatever else to understand our point and sort of resonate with it somehow. But I don't know if I could see that happening. So I think I think a dictator might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, you say that now. When you actually get the dictator, the thing
Depending
is,
on who it is, of course, and
And
their
what they
ideals
say
and
up front is probably not gonna correspond
for
to
sure.
what they
Yeah.
end up doing, which again is why I'm just out of I don't put a lot of stock in national politics or what's happening with the country as a whole. Let's just build our own system, and that's my politics. It's like not how can we gain control of this society with a bunch of nons and liberals and people who are never going to align with us, who are not susceptible to rational discourse. Instead, create our own society where we can have the right things ascend. You think that's possible?
Yeah, or you can do that, and then there's also the concept of, just be ready for when the time does come, uh, educate
Hmm.
everybody and, work out and do all the good things. And then eventually, hopefully, there will be a turning point and we can actually be ready for it and not, be watching the TV instead.
Well, not a bad thought, sure. Um, but yeah, good discussion, covered a lot of ground. Interesting X account if you want to follow. Nothing else in particular, I
Nothing
guess, to
else.
point to. Yeah, no YouTube channel or any of that.
No, I got
It
nothing.
looks like, unfortunately, the entropy is not allowing paid donations. A few people are saying in there, so we do not have super chats. But and I didn't give people a chance to ask questions. Usually, I like to include the audience a little bit. It's already been 2 hours, so I guess we'll go ahead and call it a night. It is at Shay Unleashed on X. And for those who don't know, in my YouTube audience, my X is at Arvol underscore. So good talk, Shay. I'll go ahead and uh, get this closed up here. But yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your evening. I think I did this in the wrong order. Shoot.